On a still July morning in 1978, Silas Bremer stood knee-deep and everybody at the feed store already knew, and everybody agreed it was a waste. The company that lost those logs had folded rather than pay to fish them out. But he had a grandfather's journal that told him exactly why. The tongs bit into the oak and held, and Silas Bremer felt the whole river argue with him. He was 31 years old, standing knee-deep in the brown current of the Gasconade near Vienna, and the log under his hands did not want to leave the bottom it had rested on for 11 years. He leaned back against the winch line, and the wet iron chain came up dripping, and the log rolled once in the mud, and a slow cloud of silt bloomed dark around his legs. He did not hurry. He had learned, from a man now 7 years dead, that a thing worth pulling out of the water comes up on the water schedule, not yours. The log broke the surface black, not brown like driftwood, not gray like a barn board. Black, the way a cast iron skillet is black, with the water sheeting off it and the fine grain running down its flank in tight, straight lines closer together than any living tree grows them. It weighed better than half again what a fresh-cut white oak of the same length would weigh, and every ounce of that extra weight was the reason he was out there, and the reason everybody else thought he was a fool. He worked the log up onto the flat timber barge and let it lie there, streaming, and he stood over it a moment with his hands on his hips, breathing. Around his neck, on a bootlace gone soft with age, hung a brass-cased pocket compass that had belonged to his grandfather. It swung forward when he bent, and he tucked it back inside his gray undershirt without thinking about it, the way you tuck away a thing your hand has known your whole life. One log. He looked upriver, where the channel bent past a gravel bar and the water went deep and slow in the shade of the sycamores. Somewhere down in that dark, in the cold, oxygen-starved mud, lay close to 3,000 more. Let me tell you about Silas Bremer, because you cannot understand what he did on that river unless you understand the ground he came off of and the man who taught him to see it. The Bremer place sat on 160 acres of Maries County bottom and hill, most of the good bottom lying in a long crescent along the inside of the river's bend, the rest running up into oak and hickory too steep to plow. It was not a rich farm. It had never been a rich farm. Silas's father had died when Silas was 19, of a heart that gave out behind a disc harrow on a hot afternoon, and since then the place had been run by Silas and his mother, Margaret, with a hired man in haying season when they could spare the wage. They ran 40 cows and put up hay and grew corn on the bottom in a wet year and watched the corn burn in a dry one. And every December, Margaret sat down at the kitchen table with a green cloth-bound ledger and made the year come out to something a little above nothing. Margaret was in her late 50s then, slim and straight-backed, silver hair pinned in a low bun, and she carried that green ledger under her arm the way other women carried a Bible. She had married into the Bremers, and she had learned the family's one hard lesson early. You do not borrow against next year to pay for this one, because next year on the Gasconade is a coin toss, and the house takes half. They owned their ground free and clear. It was the one thing they had that no bank and no drought and no dropping price could touch, and Margaret guarded it the way you guard the last dry match in a wet camp. So Silas had grown up poor in cash and rich in a thing that is harder to name. He had grown up in the presence of his grandfather, Otto Bremer, and Otto had built the mill. You could still walk down to it in 1978, though the wheel had not turned in years. Otto had come up the river in the 1890s as a young man and had found the same thing Silas would find, which is that a river is a machine that runs for free, if you know how to hitch to it. He had built a water-powered grist mill on a cut stone foundation he laid by hand, And for 40 years, the farmers of the Upper Gasconade had hauled their wheat and their corn to Otto Bremer to be ground. And Otto had taken his toll in flour and meal and made a living out of falling water. He died in 1971, in the spring, of nothing more dramatic than being 88 years old, and he left behind two things that mattered. He left a workshop full of cast-iron tools, chisels and calipers and dressing hammers, and a long-handled sledge, every one of them oiled and hung on its own peg. And he left his journals. Otto wrote everything down. He wrote in a small, upright German hand in leather-bound books, and he wrote not just what he did, but why, and what he had gotten wrong the first time, and how the river behaved in a flood year against a drought year. There were 11 of those journals on a shelf in the mill workshop, and in the 7 years since Otto's death, exactly one person had read all 11 of them, cover to cover, some passages a dozen times. Otto had a saying. He said it to Silas when Silas was a boy sweeping shavings, and he said it in the journals in 3 or 4 different ways, and it came down to this. Most people see a thing, and they see what it is right now. They see a downed tree, and they see a chore. Otto saw a downed tree, and he saw 40 years of sun already stored up in the grain, waiting to be spent. The whole difference between a poor man and a man who eats, Otto wrote once, is which of those two things you are looking at. Now, let me tell you about the wood, because you need to understand what the river was holding before you can understand why one man's firewood was another man's fortune. In 1973, the Fenwick Lumber Company ran a sawmill 12 miles upstream, and Fenwick floated its logs down to the mill the old way, in loose rafts on the spring high water. It was a cheap way to move timber, and it worked most years. But timber is not all the same weight. White oak, dense and heavy to begin with, will float when it is green, and then, log by log, as the water soaks into the cut ends and works down the grain, it will begin to ride lower. And then a swell will come, and then it is gone, sunk to the bottom in the deep, slow holes where the current cannot roll it back up. Fenwick lost logs every drive. Every mill that drove oak lost logs. It was a cost of doing business. Then, in the summer of '73, the spring drive hung up on a gravel bar in low water, and a sudden rise caught the whole raft strung out through 3 miles of channel, and Fenwick lost close to 3,000 logs in a single week. White oak mostly, the best timber on the tract. Some walnut mixed in, which is heavier still and sinks even more surely, and which is worth a great deal more. Fenwick was already thin. Losing that much timber in 1 week was the push that put them over. Within the year, the company folded, and here is the part that matters. When a company folds, somebody has to pay to clean up what it leaves. Recovering 3,000 sunken logs from a river bottom is slow, dangerous, expensive work. And the logs, everyone agreed, were ruined anyway. Waterlogged. Rotten, people said, though people who said it had never pulled one up. So Fenwick's owners did the sensible thing. They dissolved the company, let it die on paper, and walked away from the river bottom rather than spend $1 to recover a log they believed was worthless. The logs became nobodies. They lay in the mud, and the county forgot them, and the men at the feed store told the story of the great Fenwick loss the way you tell a story about a hailstorm, as a thing that happened to somebody else and could not be helped. Silas Bremer, that same summer, was reading his grandfather's journals. He found the passage on a winter night, and he came back to it 100 times after. Otto had written it decades before, about oak sills he had pulled from an old mill pond to reuse. Wood that lies in cold water, Otto wrote, out of the reach of air, does not rot the way wood in the weather rots. Rot is a living thing, and living things need air. Down in the deep mud, where no air comes, the wood does not decay. It changes. The minerals in the river water creep into the grain across the years and stain it dark and set it hard. And the last of the sap sugars leach away, so the fiber left behind is tighter and heavier and steadier than the tree ever was standing up. It will not warp, it will not check. A cabinet maker, Otto wrote, would give his eye teeth for such stuff, and cannot buy it new at any price, because you cannot rush what only time in the water can do. Silas read that, and then he read it again, and then he lay awake. He knew where 3,000 logs of white oak and walnut had lain in cold, deep water for 5 years. He knew that the men who had lost them believed they were ruined. And he knew, because a dead man had told him in a small, upright hand, that the men who lost them were exactly the ones Otto had warned him about. They were looking at what the wood was right now. A sunk log, a loss, a thing to walk away from. There was no one to ask. That was the strange weight of it, the thing that sat on him that first night in the mill workshop, the lantern turned low, and the 11 journals on the shelf, and the cold iron tools hanging on their pegs. If his father had been alive, or his grandfather, he would have laid it in front of them and waited to be told he was a fool, or told to go ahead. There was nobody to tell him either one. He was the only person alive who had read the reason the wood was valuable, and being the only one who knows a thing is a lonely kind of certainty. He turned the lantern up a little and opened the journal to the sinker oak page and set the brass compass on the bench beside it, and he made up his mind alone. The next morning he brought it to his mother. Margaret Bremer read numbers the way some people read faces. Silas sat her down at the kitchen table with a page of his own figuring, and she set her green ledger aside and picked up his page and read it slowly, top to bottom, and then she read it again, because Margaret never let anyone hurry her past a number. He had laid it out plain. The logs were free, not cheap. Free, abandoned stock that belonged to a company that no longer existed, lying on a river bottom that ran along their own ground. What it would cost was his summer and the materials to build a barge and a winch to lift them, and the risk that Otto was wrong about the wood, which Silas did not believe but had written down anyway because his mother would want it there. "You'd be on the river all summer," Margaret said. It was not a question. It was her way of holding a thing up to the light. "Most of it. And the hay. I'll take the hay off first. The dredging keeps. The logs have kept 11 years. They'll keep another month." She looked at the page a while longer. She did not say it was foolish. She did not say the thing Delbert Castle would say. She had lived on that river long enough to know that Otto Bremer had eaten off the water for 40 years while smarter men starved on dry ground, and she had a respect for the Bremer way of seeing that ran deeper than her caution. But her caution ran deep too. "You'll not borrow $1 for it," she said finally. "No. Because I'll tell you what I've told you. The ground is not for the bank to touch. Whatever this costs, it comes out of what we have and no more. And if it comes to nothing, we're out a summer and not a foot of ground." $85, Silas said. "About, in materials. I've got it counted." Margaret set the page down flat and smoothed it with the side of her hand, an old habit. "Then it's your summer to spend," she said, and that was the permission, such as it was. And there was no ceremony in it, because Margaret put no ceremony in anything that could be said plainly. The $85 is worth walking through, because the whole thing turned on it being small. The barge was the biggest piece, and it cost the least, because Silas built it out of the farm's own dead timber and a pair of empty fuel drums Castles had thrown behind their yard, hammered watertight and lashed under a deck of salvaged planking. The drums were free. The planking was off a fallen shed. What he had to buy was the hardware. A hand winch, the geared kind meant for pulling a stuck truck, cost him $31 secondhand from a man in Bell who had quit the towing business. 40 feet of chain, at the weight he needed to hold a soaked oak log, ran him $26. The grappling tongs he made himself in the mill workshop out of 2 pieces of wagon iron and a pin, forge bent over Otto's own anvil, so the tongs cost him nothing but a Saturday and a little coal. Cable and thimbles and a snatch block came to $12.15. A can of paint to keep the drums from rusting through, $2 and a nickel. Rope, $7. Bolts and washers and a bag of assorted hardware, $4.40. He wrote it in the cheap notebook he carried, line by line in pencil, and totaled it at the bottom the way Otto had taught him to total everything. $84.85. Against that, he wrote a second figure, one he had gotten from a furniture restorer's catalog Margaret found for him at the county library through interlibrary loan. A catalog that listed reclaimed sinker white oak, dried and milled, at a price per board foot that Silas had to read 3 times before he believed it. He did the arithmetic on a single average log, and the number that came out the other end was large enough that he closed the notebook and sat still for a minute. Then he went to town, because there was one thing he could not make and could not scrounge, and that was a proper set of sawmill bandsaw blades for when the wood came time to cut, and the only man who stocked them was Delbert Castle. Castle Lumber and Supply had been on the square in town for as long as anyone could remember, and Delbert Castle behind the counter for most of it. He was in his middle 60s, stocky and barrel-chested, with a heavy belly and a thick, short neck, iron gray hair combed straight back, gold wire glasses down his nose. He wore a gray snap-button shirt with his own name stitched in red over the pocket, and he stood with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders and his chin up, and there was not a man in 3 counties who knew more about lumber or was more sure that he knew it. He was not a cruel man. That is important. He gave credit to families in a bad year and carried them, and he told the truth as he saw it, and he had earned the right to hold court at that counter by being right about wood for 40 years. Silas laid it out for him plain, the way he had for his mother. The Fenwick logs, Otto's journals, the sinker oak and what it cured into and what it was worth. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Delbert Castle started laughing. It was not a sharp laugh, and it was not mean. It came up slow out of that big chest, and it rolled, and he took his glasses off and wiped his eyes with the back of one thick hand, and he shook his head the whole time like a man who has heard the best thing all week. It was the laugh of a man who has spent his life around wood and knows exactly what water does to it, and is watching a young fellow he has known since boyhood get ready to throw a summer into a river. It was long experience meeting something it had never met before, and mistaking the never met before for the impossible. "Silas," he said when he could talk. "Silas, son, I have sold lumber on this square since before your daddy shaved. You know what a log does when it lays in the water. It punks. It goes soft and gray, and it stinks, and it's fit for nothing but the stove, and half of it's not even fit for that. Fenwick didn't leave those logs in the river because they were dumb. They left them because they were ruined, and they knew it, and they were right." He put his glasses back on. "You go dredge up firewood a fool wouldn't burn if you want to spend your summer that way. But don't come in here and tell me it's furniture wood, because I'll laugh again, and I'm too old to laugh that hard twice in one day." Silas did not argue. This is worth understanding about him, because he never once in the whole long story raised his voice at a doubter. He answered Delbert Castle the way you answer a man you respect who is simply wrong. He told him that rot is aerobic, that it needs oxygen, that the deep mud of the river bottom has none, that the same water that would ruin the log in a month at the surface preserves it and mineralizes it across years down where the air can't reach. He told him what mineral staining does to the color and what the loss of the sap sugars does to the density. He said it plainly and without heat, the specifics of it. And then he bought the bandsaw blades he had come for and paid cash and asked for a receipt. "You want a receipt?" Delbert said, still shaking his head, tearing it off the pad. "I want a receipt," Silas said, and took it and left. Behind him at the counter, Delbert Castle told the next man in line about it, and by evening the story had gone around the feed store and the cafe and both church suppers, and the county had its summer's entertainment. The Bremer boy dredging the river for rotten logs, thinking he'd struck gold in the mud. They did not say it to hurt him, they said it the way you talk about weather. And Silas heard about it the way you always hear. And he took his notebook and his tongs and his $84 barge and went to the river, and he began. The first full summer on the water taught Silas Bremer that reading a thing in a dead man's journal and doing it with your own 2 hands under a July sun are separated by a distance no book can close. The work went like this. He would pull the barge out over a hole where he had marked logs, and he would sound the bottom with a long iron rod, feeling for the hard ring of oak under the soft give of mud. When he found one, he would work the grappling tongs down the rod's line and set them by feel, blind, in 8 or 10 feet of murky water. And this alone could take an hour, setting and resetting, feeling the tongs slide off the round of the log again and again until they bit into the bark and held. Then he would come back to the winch and begin to crank. Here is the thing about lifting a soaked oak log off a river bottom with a hand winch, and it is pure physics, and it nearly broke him before he understood it. A green oak log is heavy. A sinker log, soaked through and packed with mud, is far heavier, better than half again. But the real enemy was not just the weight. It was suction. A log that has lain in fine mud for 11 years is gripped by that mud along its whole length, and the first pull is not against the weight of the log at all, but against the vacuum of the bottom trying to hold it. And until that seal breaks, the winch is pulling against the entire river. So he learned to work the log first, to rock it with the current and the barge's own drift, to break the suction before he ever tried to lift. And only when he felt the bottom let go with a soft, heavy shudder up the chain would he settle in and crank the dead weight up through the water. A hand winch multiplies your strength, but it charges you in distance. To lift a log 2 feet, you might crank the handle around 40 times, and each turn against a soaked oak log put every pound of Silas's lean frame into the handle. And he did it in the sun, with the sweat running into his eyes and the deer flies at the back of his neck. And when the log finally rolled onto the deck, he would sit down on it and shake for a minute before he pulled to the bank. Let me pause here and ask you something directly, because it matters to what comes next. When was the last time you did a thing every day for a whole season, hard physical work, with nobody believing it would come to anything, and no proof yet that it would, only a dead man's handwriting and your own stubborn certainty telling you to keep going? Most people never find out what that costs, because most people quit somewhere in the first 2 weeks, when the novelty is gone and the muscles are torn and the town is laughing and the pile on the bank is still just a few black, ugly logs that do not yet look like anything but the firewood Delbert Castle said they were. Silas found out what it costs. It cost everything he had, every day, and he paid it, and the pile grew. He hauled each log to the bank and rolled it up above the high water line, and he stacked them off the ground on cross timbers, stickered with narrow strips between the courses so the air could move. And he began the long, slow business of drying, which for oak this dense would take not weeks, but years. He was not building a woodpile. He was starting a bank, and the interest on it was time. By the middle of that first summer, he had 41 logs on the bank, and he was cranking up the 42nd, a long, heavy butt log of white oak from the deepest hole he had yet worked, when the winch frame failed. He had built the frame himself, bolted to the deck timbers, and he had built it strong, or thought he had. But he had not reckoned on the exact line the load took when a log hung straight down off the snatch block, all its dead weight pulling not out but down and back against the frame's weakest joint. He heard it before he felt it, a sharp crack of splitting wood, and then the whole winch frame tore loose off the deck with a shriek of pulling bolts, and the handle spun free and caught him across the forearm hard enough to lay it open. And the log, 40 feet of soaked oak he had spent an hour and a half raising, dropped straight back down through the water and rolled off the tongs and settled into the channel in a slow brown boil of silt. He stood on the barge bleeding, holding his arm, looking at the water going smooth again over the log he had lost. The failure taught him something specific, and this is the whole discipline of the thing: that a failure you diagnose is worth more than a success you don't understand. He tied his arm off with his shirt and pulled to the bank and sat down on the pile of dried logs and made himself look at what had happened instead of feeling it. The frame had not failed because it was too weak in general. It had failed at one joint, and it had failed because the load path ran wrong. He had braced the frame to resist a pull straight out, the way a truck winch pulls, because that was the winch's design. But he was not pulling out. He was pulling down and back, lifting dead weight vertically off the bottom, and the whole force of it had come down on a joint he had never meant to carry it. He had built the right machine for the wrong direction. He drew the failure in his notebook, the load, the joint, the line of the pull, and under it he drew the frame he would build to replace it. Silas rebuilt the winch frame over 4 days in the mill workshop, and he built it around the load instead of against it. The new frame ran the lifting force straight down a heavy timber post set into a socket in the barge's main beam, so that a log hanging off the block pulled the post down into its socket, into the strongest structure he had, instead of prying at a bolted joint. He triangulated it with a pair of angle braces off Otto's own square, and he backed the whole thing with iron strap forged flat over the anvil. When he was done, the frame did not resist the load. It welcomed it. Every pound a log weighed pressed the post more firmly home. It was the difference between a man bracing his arm out to stop a push and a man setting his feet under a weight to lift it. And the difference was everything. He tested it on the very log he had dropped, going back to the same hole, resetting the tongs blind in the murk. And this time, when he broke the suction and settled into crank, the frame stood silent and solid and took the dead weight without a groan. And the long butt log came up out of the water, black and streaming, and rolled onto the deck. And Silas stood over it with his rebuilt machine under his feet and understood that he had crossed some line. He was not trying anymore to see whether the thing could be done. He knew it could be done. Now it was only a question of how many. The second summer he settled into a rhythm, and the rhythm produced numbers, and Margaret, without being asked, began to keep them. She came down to the bank one evening to bring him his supper and found him counting the pile, walking the rows and touching each log and moving his lips, and she watched him a while. And then she went back to the house and came down the next evening with a fresh page in the back of her green ledger and a pencil. And she said, "You count them out loud and I'll write them down, and then you're not standing here at dusk doing it in your head." And after that, she came most evenings and kept the tally, log by log, oak and walnut sorted into 2 columns, and the ledger that had never held anything but the thin arithmetic of a hill farm began to fill with a second kind of figure, a figure that grew every week and never shrank. The sorting mattered more than the counting. Silas learned to read a log the moment it broke the surface, before the mud was even washed off. The white oak came up with that tight, straight grain, and the mineral stain running gunmetal gray to near black through the length of it. The walnut, rarer, 1 log in 15 or 20, came up darker still. A deep chocolate that went almost purple where the water minerals had worked deepest, and heavier even than the oak. And Silas set every stick of walnut aside in its own row, because he had read in the restorer's catalog what reclaimed sinker walnut brought, and the number had no business being real. He handled each walnut log like it was a thing that might be taken from him. By July of the second summer, the 2 rows on the bank held better than 600 logs, and the thing had gotten too big to keep entirely quiet. And a man came to look. He drove down from 2 counties north in a panel truck, a furniture restorer named Aldous Crane, who worked on old pieces for people in the cities and was forever short of the one thing he could not buy, which was old-growth wood with old-growth density to patch and match antiques that were made before the big timber was gone. He had heard, third or fourth hand, that a fellow on the Gasconade had dredged up a mess of old sinker oak, and he had come to laugh or to buy. He wasn't sure which, and he walked down to the bank with his hands in his pockets and his mind mostly made up that it would be junk. He stopped at the end of the first row. He walked down it slow. He took his hands out of his pockets. He knelt at a butt log that Silas had adzed a fresh face onto so the grain showed, and he ran his thumb across the cut. And he was quiet for a long time. "You know what you've got here," he said finally. It was not a question, and there was something careful in it, the way a man is careful when he has walked in on something and doesn't want to show his hand. "I know what I've got," Silas said. Crane stood up. He looked down the row, and then down the second row, and then back up the bank where the count kept going. Black log on black log, stacked and stickered and drying in the sun. More of it than he had seen in one place in his life, more than existed for sale anywhere he knew of. "There's not this much sinker white oak for sale in the whole middle of this country," he said, half to himself. "And you've got walnut." He had seen the darker row. "Son, how much walnut have you got?" "Enough," Silas said, "that I'm not selling it green off the bank. It dries first, then it's milled right. Then we talk price." That evening, Margaret wrote the day's count into the ledger, and when she was done, the number in the 2 columns together passed 1,000 logs, and she underlined it twice, and neither of them said anything. But Silas walked back up to the house in the dark, thinking not about the 1,000 logs behind him, but about the 2,000 still lying on the bottom. And what a man could build if he stopped thinking of them as logs at all, and started thinking of them as the thing they were about to become. The first logs he had pulled, in that first July, had been drying nearly 2 years by the time he ran one through the saw. And when the blade came out the far side of the cut, Silas Bremer saw what no living tree grows. He had rebuilt a small mill setup in the shed, the old bandsaw fitted with the blades he had bought that day from Delbert Castle, and he squared up a dried oak log and fed it through, slow, and the wood peeled open along the cut, and there it was. The mineral stain that had looked near black on the outside ran all the way through. Not a surface color, but the color of the wood itself now. A deep, smoked gray-brown, streaked darker along the grain lines. And the grain lines themselves ran tighter and straighter than any oak he had ever cut off the hill. The growth rings so close a man could barely count them. He planed a board smooth and held it to the light, and the surface came up with a depth to it, a chatoyance, that new wood simply does not have. It looked 100 years old because it was more than 100 years old, grown slow in old forest, then cured a decade in cold water, and there was no way on earth to make it faster. He weighed a board and figured its density against a fresh oak board of the same size, and the sinker board ran better than a quarter again as heavy, which meant a quarter again as much wood packed into the same space, which is the whole secret of why it will not warp and will not check and will hold an edge and a joint like iron. Then he did the arithmetic that Delbert Castle had laughed at, and this time there was no laughing anywhere in the county. The materials in that board had cost him, if you spread the $84.85 of his whole rig across the 1,000-odd logs it had lifted, something too small to properly measure. Call the recovery cost of the wood in a single average log a matter of a few dimes in worn chain and a Saturday's coal. Against that, Aldous Crane, standing in the shed with a milled board of the sinker oak in his two hands, named a price per board foot for dried and milled sinker white oak that made a single good log worth better than $200, and a single good walnut log worth 3 or 4 times that. A few dimes of chainware against $200 a log, a thing Fenwick had paid nothing to abandon because they were sure it was worth less than nothing. Silas sold Crane a first small load, oak only, dried and milled, and he wrote the sale in his notebook, and the figure in the sale column was larger than the whole farm had cleared in the best corn year of the decade. He held the receipt a while before he filed it, the way his mother held a number up to the light. But it was a small thing that happened that same fall that turned Silas's whole idea sideways and showed him the true size of what lay under the river. He had thought all along in logs. Pull a log, dry a log, sell a log. Even at 1,000 logs, he was still thinking of it as a woodpile, a very valuable woodpile, but a woodpile. Then one October afternoon, the river dropped hard in a dry spell to the lowest Silas had ever seen it, and the deep holes that had hidden the Fenwick loss for 11 years pulled back their water and showed their bottoms. And Silas walked the bank of the long hole below the gravel bar and looked down into water gone clear and shallow, and he saw them. Not a log, not a dozen logs. He saw the bottom of that hole carpeted with them, black shapes lying in ranks and crosses and heaps for as far down the channel as he could see, hundreds in that one hole alone. And he understood in that moment, standing on the bank, that he had spent 2 summers and lifted 1,000 logs, and he had barely started. The loss was not a woodpile. It was a deposit. It was 2,000 more logs of the finest close-grained old-growth oak and walnut in the state, lying free on a bottom that belonged to no one. More furniture wood than a working shop could go through in 20 years. And every log of it was the exact material that cabinet makers and restorers across the country could not buy new at any price, because the trees that grew it were gone from the earth. And it reframed everything. Because a man with a woodpile sells wood. But a man with 20 years of irreplaceable timber under his own river, timber he owns by the simple fact that nobody else will lift it, is not in the woodpile business at all. He is in the business of whatever he decides to build, and it will not run out in his lifetime. Silas stood on that bank in the low October water and did the thing his grandfather had taught him. He stopped looking at what it was. He looked at what it could become. And what rose up in his mind, clear as the shallow water, was the mill. Otto's mill. Standing dead these 7 years on its cut stone foundation, and here was Silas with an endless supply of the one material that could rebuild it to run another 100 years. Timber that would not rot in the wet of a mill race. Timber his grandfather had told him from the grave exactly where to find. He would not just sell the wood. He would use it to bring the mill back to life. The cut stone foundation of Otto Bremer's mill had stood 80 years and was good for 80 more. Which is the first thing you learn when you clear the brush off an old stone foundation and put your hands on it. Silas spent a week with a grubbing hoe and a scythe taking down the sumac and the honeysuckle that had swallowed the mill's lower walls. And when he had it clear, he stood in the roofless stone shell and read the building the way he read a log. And he found that Otto had built for the ages. The walls were plumb. The great sill sockets were cut clean. The wheel pit was silted but sound. The bones of the thing were waiting. Let me tell you how a water-powered grist mill actually works, because Silas had to learn every piece of it from the journals, and the learning is the pleasure of it. You do not run a mill on the river itself. You run it on a controlled slice of the river, and the whole art is in the control. Upstream, a low dam or a diverting weir lifts a portion of the flow into a mill race, a channel that carries the water along a gentle grade, losing less height than the river does, so that by the time the race reaches the mill, it runs well above the level of the tail race below. That difference in height is called the head, and head times flow is your power, and everything else is gearing. The water drops from the race onto the wheel, and if it drops onto the top of the wheel and drives it by weight, filling bucket after bucket on the downside, that is an overshot wheel, and it is the most efficient kind. And it was the kind Otto had built. The wheel turns slow and strong. Then a train of wooden and iron gears, the pit gear and the wallower and the great spur wheel, trades that slow, strong turning for the fast turning the millstones need. And the top stone spins above the fixed bottom stone, and the grain feeds down through the eye in the center and works out toward the rim between the dressed faces of the two stones, and comes off the edge as flour and meal. Every part of that had to be rebuilt, and the part that would kill an ordinary rebuild was the water. Wood that lives in a mill race lives wet, splashed and soaked and never allowed to dry. An ordinary timber in a mill race rots in a decade and has to be replaced, which is one of the reasons the old mills died, because nobody wanted to keep buying timber to feed the water. But Silas was not building out of ordinary timber. He was building out of sinker oak that had already spent 11 years underwater and come out harder for it. Oak that the wet could not touch, because the wet had already done its worst and been beaten. He cut sluice timber and race lining and wheel buckets out of the densest of his dried sinker stock, and he fitted it knowing it would outlast him and his children both. He set the great sinker beams onto Otto's stone foundation with a block and tackle, and levered them home into the 80-year-old sockets, and they dropped in like the stone had been cut for them that morning. And Silas stood in the wheel pit that evening with the brass compass at his neck and Otto's cast-iron dressing hammer in his hand, and felt, for the first time, something close to what a man feels when he is not alone. But there was one night that winter when quitting was real. It came after a hard week when the sluice he had built leaked at every joint no matter how he caulked it, and the money from the wood sales had gone faster than he'd figured into iron and gearing stock. And Margaret's ledger showed the second kind figure not growing, but shrinking for the first time. And the cold got down into the wheel pit and into Silas's torn-up hands. And Delbert Castle's laugh came back to him at 3 a.m, the way a doubter's laugh always comes back at 3 a.m. And Silas lay in his bed and thought, plainly and without drama, that he could stop. He could sell the dried wood off as it sat, take the good money it would bring, walk away from the mill as a fool's rebuild, and be a man who had made a decent turn on some sunken logs. Nobody would blame him. His mother would not blame him. The wood alone had already made the summer's pay. He lay with that a long time, and it was a true temptation, not a straw man, because the wood really would have paid, and the mill really might not. And what turned him was not stubbornness, and it was not pride. It was a line from Otto's journal that he had read so many times it came to him in the dark, unbidden. The line about the downed tree and the 40 years of stored sun. And Otto's plain observation underneath it that the difference between a poor man and a man who eats is only which of two things he is looking at. Selling the wood was looking at what it was. Building the mill was looking at what it could become. Silas got up before dawn and went down to the wheel pit and started again on the sluice. The first full test of the wheel and sluice failed, and it failed in a way that told him exactly what was wrong. He raised the gate and let the water into the race for the first time, and it ran down and dropped onto the wheel, and the great wheel began to turn, slow and grand. And for about a minute, Silas Bremer's heart came up into his throat. Then the wheel slowed. Then it labored. Then it hung, half-turned, the water spilling and slopping and doing no work, and the gear train below groaning and standing still. The mill had run for 1 minute and stopped, and the water poured off the stalled wheel and back into the tail race, wasted. And Silas shut the gate and stood in the sudden quiet. He did not curse it. He got a lantern because dusk was coming, and he climbed down into the pit and read the failure the way he read everything, looking for the specific fault and not the general despair. And he found 2 things wrong, and both of them were his own doing. The correction took him a month, and it was a lesson in geometry and patience both. The first fault was the sluice grade. He had built the race to carry the water, but he had built it a hair too flat over its last stretch, so the water arrived at the wheel with plenty of volume but not enough velocity, dropping onto the buckets soft instead of driving into them, and a soft drop on an overshot wheel is wasted head. He had lost, over the length of the race, 1.5 inches of fall he could not spare. So he redug the last 40 feet of the race to a truer grade, checking it foot by foot with Otto's own level and a chalked string, until the water came to the lip of the sluice fast and full, and dropped onto the wheel with force enough to bury each bucket to its throat. The second fault was in the wheel itself. It was out of balance. He had built the buckets true, but hung the wheel a touch off center on its shaft, so that its own weight fought it a quarter of every turn, and a wheel that fights itself will stall the moment the load comes on. He shimmed and re-hung it, spinning it free by hand 100 times, watching where it wanted to stop, working the balance until the wheel had no low side, until it would drift to rest anywhere he left it like a wheel with no memory of down. And then there were the stones. And here Otto reached out of the grave and taught him the finest work in the whole mill. The faces of millstones are not flat. They are cut with a pattern of shallow furrows, called the dress, that channel the grain from the center to the rim and shear it as the stones pass. And the dress wears and must be recut, sharpened by hand with a mill pick. And getting the dress right is the difference between flour and gravel. Otto's journals held pages of it, the depth and the pitch and the lay of the furrows, drawn in the small upright hand, and Otto's own mill picks hung on their pegs in the workshop. And Silas took them down and spent a week on his knees over the bottom stone, tapping, reading the old man's drawings, dressing the stone the way Bremer's had dressed stones on that river for 80 years. The brass compass swung at his neck the whole time. He used every one of Otto's tools. Not one of them had been replaced with something newer, because not one of them needed replacing, which is a thing about a good tool and a good man both. Then, on a morning in the spring, he raised the gate again. The water ran down the trued race fast and full, and dropped hard into the buckets, and the balanced wheel took it and turned, slow and strong, and did not slow, and did not labor. And the pit gear engaged the wallower, and the wallower drove the great spur wheel, and the spur wheel spun the stone, and Silas fed a first double handful of wheat into the eye, and the mill came alive under him with a low, steady rumble he had heard as a boy, and had not heard in 7 years. And out from between the turning stones, warm to the touch, came flour. Clean, fine, stone-ground flour, sifting down into the bin the way it had for his grandfather. the way it had before the river ever swallowed a Fenwick log. He ran it under real load all that day and measured what it did. And the mill ground a bushel of wheat into flour, cleaner and faster than Silas had dared hope. Better than 100 pounds of finished flour in an hour once he had it running steady. And the wheel never slowed, and the sinker beams never groaned, and the water came off the tail race, having spent every ounce of its work inside the stone walls Otto Bremer laid by hand. Delbert Castle came to see it in early summer, and he came alone. He did not come with the men from the feed store, and he did not come to hold court. He drove down the farm lane in the evening in his own truck and parked at the top by the house and walked down to the mill by himself, an old stocky man in his gray shirt with his name on the pocket and his gold glasses catching the low sun, the yellow carpenter's pencil still behind his ear the way it had been for 40 years. He stood in the doorway of the running mill and watched the wheel turn and the stones grind and the flour come down. And he watched a good long while, and Silas let him watch and said nothing, because a man owed that. Then Delbert Castle took off his glasses, the way he had the day he laughed, and he wiped his face, but he was not laughing this time. "I was wrong," he said. 3 words, that was all, and he did not decorate them, and you could see what they cost him. Because a man who has been the one who knows about wood for 40 years does not give up being right without it taking something out of him. He put his glasses back on and looked at the black sinker beams holding up the sluice, and he shook his head slow, not in scorn now, but in a kind of wonder at himself. "I sold you the blades," he said, "and I laughed you out of my store. And you cut this out of firewood a fool wouldn't burn." He said it plain. Then he did the thing a decent man does, which is to make it good with his hands and not just his mouth. "That mill race gate you've got is going to hang up on you inside a year, the way you've pinned it. I've got the proper cast fittings for it in my backstock. Been there since before the war. Nobody's wanted them. They're yours. And I know every baker and every restorer's outfit from here to the river towns, because I've sold them lumber for 30 years, and starting tomorrow, they're going to know your name." He was as good as his word. Delbert Castle became, in the way of a decent man who has been proven wrong, the mill's first and loudest champion, and the same voice that had sent the county laughing down to the feed store now sent it down to the Bremer mill to buy. The bakers came first, and then the restorers, and the years began to stack up in Margaret's ledger the way the logs had stacked on the bank. The stone-ground flour turned out to have a market Silas had not even reckoned on when he rebuilt the mill for its own sake. The small bakeries in the river towns and up toward the city wanted flour that had been ground slow between stones instead of crushed fast between steel rollers, because the stone grind kept the whole grain and the flavor with it, and they would pay a premium and sign for it by the season. By the second year of grinding, Silas had standing contracts with 4 bakeries. By the 4th year, 11 from 3 counties, and he was grinding 6 days a week and had taken on 2 hired men off farms that could no longer carry them. And running alongside the flour the whole time was the sinker wood, the oak and the walnut coming off the bank, dried and milled, and going out to restorers and cabinet makers who had learned there was one place in the middle of the country you could buy old-growth density by the board foot, and Silas never once had to lower a price, because there was nowhere else to get it. Margaret's ledger, the green cloth-bound book that had spent 30 years making a hill farm come out to a little above nothing, filled up with figures that ran the other way. She kept 2 businesses in it now, the flour and the wood, and she totaled them every December the way she always had, slow, holding each number up to the light, and every December the total was larger than the year before. Now, you know what happened to farm country in the early 80s. You know what 18% interest did to operations that had borrowed to expand in the late 70s, When the land prices were high and the banks were free with money, and every extension officer in the Midwest was telling farmers to get big or get out. You know how it went. The men who borrowed against their land to buy more land and bigger equipment, betting on grain prices that everyone swore would keep climbing. Those men woke up in 1982 to grain prices that had collapsed and interest rates that had not. And the notes came due. And the land they had put up as collateral was worth half what they had paid. And the same banks that had pressed the money on them now called it back. And the foreclosure auctions ran every week through the winter. And neighbors Silas had known his whole life lost ground their families had held for 100 years. A drought came on top of it in the worst of those years and burned the corn that might have paid something. And that was the end for a lot of them. The Bremer place did not carry a dollar of that debt. It could not touch them, because it had never been let in the door. Margaret had set it at the kitchen table before the first log ever came off the river, and she had said it 100 times before that, going back to Otto himself. You do not borrow against next year to pay for this one. The barge and the winch had cost $84.85 out of money they had. The wood had been free. The mill had been rebuilt out of the wood's own earnings, paid for as it was built, out of that same sinker stock nobody else would lift. There was no note on the ground, and no lien on the mill, and no mortgage on the stones. And when grain prices collapsed, the mill did not care, because the mill made its money grinding other men's grain into flour for bakers, and bakers eat in a drought, same as any year. And when the land values fell, it did not matter, because Silas had never once treated his land as a chip to be bet. He had treated it as the one thing that could not be taken. And in the winter of the foreclosures, the wisdom of that was written across the whole county in auction bills. And the Bremer mill ran 6 days a week straight through it, grinding, while the operations that had done everything the smart money told them to do went under one after another. The new thing survived precisely because it had never been exposed to the risk that broke everyone else. It was built on a material that was free, with cash that was already in hand, to make a product that people needed in the fat years and the lean ones both. And there was no lever anywhere on it for a hard year to pull. The mill still grinds. It is a long time now since that first July morning when Silas Bremer closed a pair of iron tongs on a log in the brown water and gave the county its summer of laughter. He is an old man himself these days, a short-trimmed gray beard where the chestnut hair used to be, the fair skin of his forearms gone brown and creased with 50 years of river sun. But the brass compass still hangs at his neck on a bootlace, and Otto's cast-iron dressing hammer still comes down off its peg when the stones need sharpening. And not one of those tools has ever been replaced, because a good tool outlasts the hand that made it, and then outlasts the hand that inherits it too. Margaret is gone now, these 15 years. But her green ledger sits on a shelf in the mill office where anyone can take it down, full cover to cover in her small upright figures. 2 businesses run clean for 4 decades without a dollar borrowed. And the last entries she made in her own hand are still legible near the back. Aldous Crane bought Sinker Walnut off the Bremer Bank for the rest of his working life. Delbert Castle sent bakers and restorers to the mill until the day he died, and he is buried in the same town churchyard. And Silas went to the funeral and stood at the back, and never once in all the years after told the story of the laugh to anyone, because a decent man who says he was wrong has already paid, and there is no call to charge him twice. The bank still holds sinker stock, drying, stickered, curing on its own slow schedule, the way it always has, because there is still oak and walnut lying on the bottom of the gasconade that no man alive has lifted. And Silas never did get to the end of the Fenwick loss, and neither will the ones who come after him, which is the whole point of a thing that renews slower than a life. A magazine writer found the mill a few years back, one of those glossy ones about American craft and old ways, and he wrote a long piece about the man who rebuilt a water mill out of logs the river had swallowed. And after that came the invitations to speak at the millwrights' gathering, at the Woodworkers' Guild, and Silas turned most of them down because he had a mill to run, but he kept the letters in a drawer. And then, last spring, a young woman came down the farm lane with a laptop under her arm and a notebook in her hand. Silas's grandniece, 24 years old, who had grown up hearing the story and had gone off to school for chemistry and had come home with an idea. She had read, she said, about how the mineral content of the river water was what stained and hardened the sinker wood across the years. And she wanted to know exactly which minerals and in what amounts. Because if you knew that, she said, you could test a log's cure from a core sample and grade it before you ever milled it. And you could tell a restorer not just that the wood was old, but precisely how old and how dense, and price it to the board foot by science instead of by eye. She had it half worked out already in the notebook. She wanted the run of the bank and the old low water holes to sample from, and she wanted, she said, to sit down with him and go through Otto's journals, all 11 of them, because she thought the old man had written down river readings nobody had ever thought to use. Silas, who had once stood alone in a lantern-lit workshop with no living soul to ask, who had waited on his mother to read a page slowly and grant him one plain sentence of permission days later, did not make her wait at all. He said yes before she finished asking. He took her down to the mill with the wheel turning and the stones grinding and the flour coming down warm, and he put Otto's dressing hammer in her hand so she would know its weight. And he told her the thing his grandfather had told him, and that he had never yet said out loud to anyone younger. That most people look at a thing and see what it is right now: a downed tree, a sunken log, a chore, a loss. And that the whole difference between a poor man and a man who eats is which of two things he lets himself see. She wrote it in the notebook. He recovered nearly 3,000 logs the world had paid to abandon. They called it dredging for firewood. He built a barge for $84.85. He rebuilt a dead man's mill out of wood the river had cured. The interest rates came, and the drought came, and the foreclosures came, and the ground was never once for the bank to touch. The mill outlived the men who laughed at it. As of this spring, the wheel still turns, the stones still grind, and there is a young woman in the workshop with a core sampler and a laptop and 11 leather journals open on the bench, learning to read a river. This story isn't over, not even close.